The invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning in early November, tucked between a hydro bill and a grocery flyer Wesley Thornton had already decided to ignore. He stood at the kitchen counter of his apartment near Leslieville, still in yesterday's fleece, the kind of tired that came from putting a 7-year-old back to bed for the 4th time because she'd had a nightmare again. He could hear Freya in the next room, narrating something to her stuffed animals in that earnest, slightly too loud voice she used when she thought nobody was listening. The envelope was cream-colored and heavier than it needed to be. The return address said Rosedale. Of course it did. He recognized the handwriting before he even turned it over. Claudia Renner had always had the kind of penmanship that looked like it was auditioning for something. Wesley set the envelope on the counter beside his coffee mug and looked at it for a long moment. Freya padded in from the hallway, dragging a stuffed elephant by one ear. "Who's that from?" she asked, eyeing the envelope with the same suspicion she reserved for vegetables. Wesley picked up his coffee instead of the envelope. "Someone from a long time ago." Freya accepted this with the easy patience of a child who had learned early that adults had old lives that didn't always require explanation. She climbed onto the stool across from him, pulled a banana from the fruit bowl, and began peeling it with great ceremony. He opened the envelope after she'd gone back to her room. "Claudia Renner and Boyd Carmichael request the pleasure of your company at the Winter Gala celebration marking their forthcoming marriage. The Hazelton Hotel, Yorkville, Saturday, the 7th of December, black tie." There was a handwritten note beneath the printed card in that same careful cursive. "Wesley, it would mean a great deal to see you there, a chance to reconnect with old friends, close a few old chapters. I hope life has been kind to you, Claudia." He read the note twice. Then he set it down on the counter with the kind of steadiness that only came from having survived things that actually scared you. He knew Claudia well enough to read the space between the words. She wasn't reaching out for reconnection. She was reaching out for confirmation. She wanted to see the version of him she'd decided he'd become. The one who had stayed behind while she moved forward into marble countertops and a fiancé whose photo appeared in the Globe and Mail's business section at least twice a year. He almost dropped the invitation into the recycling bin. Then Freya appeared in the doorway again, this time wearing her winter hat indoors, for reasons she didn't explain. "Uncle Wesley," she said very seriously, "I've been thinking about the CN Tower." He looked at her. "I want to go to the glass floor part," she continued. "You said maybe. Maybe is closer to yes than no." Wesley looked down at the invitation, then back at Freya. "Yorkville's not far from the tower," he said. Freya's eyes went wide. "So that's a yes?" "That's a maybe that's moving in a direction." She pumped her fist once, something she'd picked up from watching hockey with him, and disappeared back down the hall. Wesley stood alone in the kitchen. He thought about Claudia the way you think about weather from years ago. You remember it happened. You remember roughly what it felt like. But the edges have softened into something more like memory than wound. 6 years earlier, she had been the person he thought he'd build something lasting with. They were both in their early 30s, both working too hard, both living in a one-bedroom near Bloor and Bathurst that smelled like coffee and old plaster. Wesley was building his consultancy from nothing. Crisis communications, mostly, helping organizations navigate the kind of problems that made executives sweat through their shirts. It was work that required strange hours and stranger clients, and it didn't pay particularly well at first. Claudia was finishing her articles at a downtown firm and had ambitions that filled every room she walked into. Wesley never begrudged her those ambitions. What he hadn't anticipated was what happened when ambition began choosing a different kind of man. Boyd Carmichael had arrived in her orbit at a fundraising event Wesley hadn't attended because he'd had a client in crisis. Boyd was polished in the way that certain men were, not because they worked at it, but because they had been curated over time by money and opportunity. He owned property development companies across the GTA and had recently expanded into investment vehicles that Wesley didn't fully understand and had reason over the following years to distrust deeply. Claudia had left on a rain-gray Thursday in April. She wasn't cruel about it. She was practical, which sometimes landed harder than cruelty. "You're a good person, Wesley," she'd said, standing near the door with her keys already in her hand. "But I can't keep waiting for something that isn't coming." He hadn't argued. He wasn't sure what he would have said. What she didn't know, what he'd chosen not to tell her, was that 3 weeks earlier, Boyd Carmichael's legal team had sent a very quiet communication to Wesley's firm, suggesting that his ongoing work with a particular whistleblower client, a mid-level environmental compliance officer at a development group connected to Boyd's investors, would be best discontinued. The message was diplomatic, careful, and entirely unmistakable. Wesley hadn't discontinued anything. What he had done was quietly move Claudia's name off every document in his office, scrub any connection between his personal life and his professional work, and put enough distance between them that the people watching his firm would find nothing useful if they went looking. He never explained this to her. He simply became less available, and she, already tilting in another direction, let the distance become permanent. His sister Rachel had died 28 months later. A highway accident on the 401 in January, the kind of morning when the roads has held ice that nobody had salted yet. She'd been 31. Her daughter Freya had been 4 years and 3 months old, and Wesley had become her legal guardian before the funeral flowers had dried. Parenting, he discovered, did not wait for grief to finish its first draft. But Freya was. Wesley never had exactly the right word for it. She was the truest thing that had happened in his adult life. She asked questions nobody else thought to ask and accepted most of his answers without judgment. She had Rachel's laugh, exact, and sometimes it arrived in the middle of ordinary moments and stopped Wesley completely for just a second, before he caught himself. His consultancy had grown steadily in the years since Claudia left, not loudly. Thornton's strategic group didn't advertise. It didn't need to. The kind of clients who found Wesley Thornton were the kind who couldn't afford to make noise about needing him. He confirmed the RSVP on a Wednesday, almost without meaning to. The evening of the 7th arrived cold and clear the way Toronto sometimes managed in early winter, the sky that particular shade of dark blue that looked almost warm from inside a building. Wesley dressed quietly in the spare bedroom so he wouldn't wake Freya early, then realized she'd been watching him from the doorway for some unknown amount of time. "You look different," she said, studying him with the forensic attention she usually reserved for things she was trying to decide whether to eat. Different how? More like someone from TV, she decided, but regular TV, not the boring kind. He crouched down so they were level. "Mrs. Okafor next door is coming to sit with you while I'm out." Freya looked at him with the expression that meant she was calculating how much negotiation the situation could bear. "Can I stay up until you're back?" "No." "Can I stay up until 9? "Maybe." She nodded, satisfied. The word maybe had a strong track record with him. The drive to Yorkville took 25 minutes. Wesley arrived in a dark SUV, his two-man security team, colleagues from his firm who handled executive protection on sensitive client assignments, following in a second vehicle. He didn't think of them as bodyguards, exactly. They were there because his work had made him, over the years, a person who needed to think carefully about proximity and risk. It wasn't drama. It was just the shape his life had taken. He hadn't thought much about how it would look, arriving somewhere like this. He was about to find out. The Hazelton was lit warm against the winter dark, and the entrance was already busy with black-tie guests moving through the cold in small, self-important clusters. 2 black SUVs, pulling up in sequence behind the first, caused exactly the kind of pause Wesley hadn't especially planned for. A valet moved toward the lead vehicle and then stopped, noticing the second car. The man at the entrance touched his earpiece. Conversations on the steps slowed. Wesley stepped out, checked his jacket once, and extended a hand back into the vehicle. Freya took it, stepping down onto the salted pavement in her dark green dress and the very serious small heels she had selected herself after 40 minutes of deliberation. She looked at the hotel with her eyes very wide. "There are lights everywhere," she said. "There are," Wesley agreed. One of the men from the second vehicle fell into position 3 steps behind them. Neither of them looked like they were performing anything. That, Wesley knew, was what made people uncomfortable. Professionals didn't posture. "Why is everyone staring at us?" Freya asked, not quietly. A few guests near the entrance exchanged glances. "Sometimes people stare when they're trying to figure something out," Wesley said. Oh, Freya appeared to find this reasonable. "Like when I'm trying to decide if a food is good before I taste it." Exactly like that. Inside the ballroom, the charity gala was exactly what Wesley expected and almost nothing he wanted. It was beautiful, undeniably. Long tables dressed in winter white, arrangements of cedar and white orchids, a string quartet playing pieces you'd heard before without being able to name them. Champagne in tall glasses, conversations about things that mattered only within a very specific radius of this building. Boyd Carmichael moved through the room like a man who believed the room was his. He was tall, well-maintained, with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to having his calls returned. Wesley had read the 2 most recent regulatory filings connected to Boyd's development holdings on the drive over. Some people checked the traffic, Wesley checked public records. He spotted Claudia across the room. She was in a deep navy gown, her hair up, speaking to a group of women who laughed at the right intervals. She'd always known how to work a room. That had never been one of her problems. She turned, saw him. Her expression moved through several things quickly: surprise, recalibration, something he couldn't name, before settling into practiced composure. Wesley had been placed at table 11. He noted it without expression as the coordinator led him and Freya past the main floor toward the rear section, closer to the catering corridor where the sounds of the kitchen punctuated the string quartet at irregular intervals. He'd been seated between an elderly couple who didn't seem entirely sure they'd been invited and a real estate associate whose connection to the hosts appeared decorative at best. He held Freya's chair. She sat and immediately picked up a sugar cube from the coffee service and began examining it. "These are just sugar," she announced to no one in particular. "They are," Wesley confirmed. "Why do they make sugar into cubes?" "Seemed fancier at the time, I think." She turned the cube over in her fingers thoughtfully. "Fancy doesn't always make sense," she concluded. The woman to their left, a 60-something with silver-streaked hair and reading glasses on a chain, looked over with what appeared to be genuine delight. "She's quite right, you know." Freya nodded seriously, as though she'd known this all along and was grateful someone else was catching up. Across the ballroom, the conversation about Wesley Thornton had already started. Boyd's business partner, a man named Jeff, leaned toward Boyd near the bar with a drink he hadn't touched. "You know who your fiancé put on the guest list tonight?" Boyd kept his eyes on the room. "An old boyfriend, I was told." "He runs Thornton Strategic." Jeff paused. "That name mean anything to you?" "Should it?" Jeff turned his glass slowly in his hand. "They handled communications for the Meridian environmental case last year, and the Forster Capital collapse before that, and about 4 other situations in this province that you probably remember the headlines from." He stopped. "The firm doesn't have much of a public profile. That's actually the point." Boyd looked across the room toward table 11, toward the man sitting with complete patience beside a small girl who was now apparently explaining something important to the elderly couple. Boyd's jaw moved slightly. "He came to my engagement gala with a security detail." Jeff looked at him steadily. "Uh-huh." "That's a performance," Boyd said, but the certainty at the edges of his voice had gone soft. "Sure," Jeff said, and didn't add anything else. Claudia found her way to table 11 during the second course, moving between tables with the ease of a practiced hostess. She stopped beside Wesley's chair. He stood, which he would have done for anyone. "You came," she said. Something layered moved beneath it. "You invited me," he replied simply. She looked at Freya, who had been persuaded to eat a bread roll and was currently inspecting the centerpiece arrangement with quiet scientific interest. "And this must be—" "My niece, Freya," Wesley said evenly, and watched something shift in Claudia's face when the word registered. Niece, not daughter. The question she'd been quietly assembling, about timelines, about other women, about what exactly his life had contained in the years between them, rearranged itself entirely. "She's lovely," Claudia said. "She looks like her mother," Wesley said, "my sister Rachel." He said it the way he always said it, clearly without apology or performance. The sentence still cost him something each time, but he'd learned not to let the cost show unnecessarily. Claudia's expression shifted. "I didn't know about your sister. I'm so sorry, Wesley." He nodded once. "Thank you." Freya looked up. "Are you Claudia?" Claudia blinked. "I am." "Uncle Wesley said you used to laugh at his terrible coffee," Freya said. "He said you called it motor oil. He still makes it the same way." Wesley closed his eyes briefly. Claudia looked at him. "You told her about me." "Not much," he said. "She has a memory like a satellite dish." "I retain information," Freya confirmed and returned to the bread roll. Claudia smiled, and for a moment it reached all the way to her eyes before she caught it and brought herself back to the room. "I should." She gestured toward the main floor. "Of course," Wesley said and let her go. He sat back down. The elderly woman to his left, whose name turned out to be Marjorie, had somehow ended up in a deep conversation with Freya about migratory birds, which Freya had recently become interested in after watching a documentary about Canada geese. "They fly in a V because the ones in front break the wind resistance for the ones behind," Freya explained seriously. "It's called drafting, like in cycling but with birds." Marjorie appeared genuinely charmed. "I had absolutely no idea." "Most people don't," Freya said sympathetically. Wesley watched the room continue its careful orbiting. Boyd circulated. Claudia circulated. Speeches were given about the charity, something to do with youth mentorship programs across the GTA. and the language was polished and impressive, and said everything except the specific numbers that would have made it meaningful. Then the room changed. It began near the main entrance. Wesley noticed it before most people did. Not because he was looking for it, but because he'd spent years in crisis communications, learning to read the precise moment when a room shifts from controlled to something else. A ripple moved through the crowd, heads turning, voices dropping, champagne glasses lowering slightly. A woman had entered. Late 50s, silver hair, wearing a charcoal suit that cost more than most of the gowns in the room. She was accompanied by 2 aides and a man Wesley recognized as the senior partner at one of the largest infrastructure investment houses in Ontario. Bridget Carver. Boyd Carmichael had been trying to schedule a meeting with her foundation for almost 2 years. Wesley knew this because it was in the regulatory materials he'd reviewed on the drive over. Bridget moved through the room without looking at anyone directly, the way powerful people sometimes did, not from arrogance, but from economy. She had learned long ago that the most useful thing you could do at a function like this was not waste attention on people who were simply visible. She walked directly to table 11. "Wesley," she said, and her voice carried a warmth that surprised several nearby guests. He rose. "Bridget." He looked toward his niece. "This is Freya." Bridget Carver looked down at Freya with an expression that, on a less composed face, would have been called delighted. She reached into her jacket pocket and produced a small wrapped square of dark chocolate, hotel quality, the kind that came with a room key. "I borrowed this from the front desk," she said to Freya. "I suspected there might be someone worth bribing tonight." Freya accepted it with enormous seriousness. "This is a sophisticated gift," she said. "Thank you," Bridget said, as though this were a review she'd been waiting on. She turned to Wesley. The warmth stayed, but so did something more focused beneath it. "The board wants your decision by Monday," she said quietly. "The environmental assessment file. 3 of the parties involved have accepted preliminary terms. 1 is still making noise." Wesley nodded once. "I'll have something to you by Sunday." "Good," she paused. "The Carmichael Group is the noise, in case that needs saying aloud." Wesley looked at her steadily. "I know." Boyd appeared from across the floor. He'd seen Bridget arrive and move toward her with the specific velocity of a man who'd been waiting months for exactly this proximity. He arrived at the table with his best version of relaxed confidence, hand extended. "Miss Carver," he said warmly, "Boyd Carmichael. What an unexpected." Bridget turned toward him with the polite attention of someone about to say something she had already decided on. "Mr. Carmichael," she said, "I'm aware of who you are." "Of course. I've actually been hoping to connect about the Carver Foundation's Northern infrastructure priorities." "I know," she said. "I've received your office's correspondence." She let that sentence sit and complete itself, which it did without any additional help from her. Then she turned back to Wesley as though nothing had interrupted them. Boyd stood at the edge of the conversation for a moment, his hand still faintly extended. Then he excused himself with a laugh that didn't go all the way down. The room had watched this exchange the way rooms watch things they will talk about for the next week. Several of Boyd's associates exchanged looks that Boyd did not see because he was already walking away from them. Freya tugged Wesley's sleeve. "She's scary," she whispered about Bridget. "She's decisive," Wesley said. "There's a difference." Freya appeared to be filing this distinction away for future use. What happened in the next hour happened partly because of a set of regulatory warrants, partly because of Boyd Carmichael's choices over the preceding 4 years, and not at all because of Wesley Thornton. Wesley had been engaged by an environmental review board as a communications consultant on a case that had been building since long before Claudia's invitation arrived in his mailbox. He hadn't chosen the evening. The evening had chosen itself. The first indication was the 2 men who arrived in dark coats and spoke quietly to the hotel manager near the service corridor. The second was the hotel manager's expression afterward. The particular look of someone who has just been handed a problem that will require several phone calls and a formal incident report. Boyd was on the far end of the main floor when they found him mid-sentence with a cluster of investors. He came back through the crowd with his lawyer's number already on his phone screen and his face carefully arranged to show nothing, which showed everything. There were no handcuffs. This wasn't that kind of moment. But a formal regulatory officer doesn't appear at a charity gala by accident, and the conversation that followed between Boyd and 2 men with government identification was visible from 30 feet in every direction. The room fragmented quietly. Phones came out. Boyd's associates drifted away in the manner of people discovering they had somewhere else to be. Claudia stood near the edge of the dance floor in her navy gown, very still, with the expression of someone whose carefully constructed evening had just been undermined from a direction she hadn't anticipated. Boyd found a moment to turn toward Wesley with something hard in his eyes. "This is you," he said, not loudly, just flatly. Wesley looked at him without particular expression. "I was invited to a party by your fiancée." A pause. "The board opened this file 14 months ago." Boyd opened his mouth, closed it. The regulatory officer was waiting nearby with considerable patience. Boyd left with his lawyer. The room moved into that uncomfortable aftermath that follows public spectacle, the lowered voices, the careful looks, the unspoken agreements about what had just been witnessed. The string quartet admirably kept playing. Wesley found Claudia on the outdoor terrace a short while later. The winter air off Yorkville was cold enough to see your breath. She was standing at the railing without a coat, which told him how quickly she'd moved to get outside. He took off his jacket and held it out. She looked at it for a moment, then accepted it without comment and pulled it around her shoulders. "You knew," she said. She wasn't accusing him, she was working something out. "I knew about the file," he said. "I didn't choose tonight." She turned to face him. "Why didn't you ever tell me any of it?" 6 years ago, when you started, she stopped. Reorganized herself. When you pulled away, you just got quieter and quieter, and I thought," she shook her head, "I thought you'd given up on everything." Wesley leaned against the railing beside her, looking out over the street below where winter lights strung across Yorkville reflected off the wet pavement. "Boyd's early investors were connected to the case my firm was building," he said quietly. "When they found out I wouldn't walk away from it, they started looking at my life for leverage." He paused. "You were the most visible part of my life." Claudia was quiet. "So you moved me out of the way." "I moved you out of range," he said. "There's a difference, but I understand if it didn't feel like one." She looked down at her hands. "You could have told me." "You were building something real," he said. "You were working 80-hour weeks and your whole future was assembling itself. I didn't want to hand you someone else's danger and call it love." Claudia stood in silence for a long time. The cold pressed in from the north and the city hummed below them, indifferent and luminous. "I thought you were failing," she said finally, and she said it the way people say true things they're not proud of. Flat, without softening it with context or excuse. Wesley didn't say anything. "I told people you were going nowhere," she continued. "I believed it. I think I needed to believe it so I could stop feeling guilty about leaving." A long exhale. "You were protecting me from something I didn't even know existed, and I left because I decided you weren't enough." "You couldn't have known," he said. "That almost makes it worse." He understood what she meant. Being forgiven for something you didn't know you were doing carried its own particular weight. The terrace door opened behind them. Freya appeared, wrapped in a coat that Marjorie from Table 11 had apparently contributed, holding a small piece of hotel stationery in one hand. She looked between the two adults with the focused assessment of a child who has arrived in the middle of something she's too young to fully decode and too perceptive to ignore. "Marjorie said I could find you out here," she announced. "Also, she gave me her coat because she said she was warm anyway." She looked at Claudia carefully. "Are you okay?" Claudia looked at the 7-year-old for a moment. "I'm getting there," she said. Freya considered this. Then she held out the piece of stationery. On it, in hotel pen, she'd drawn a rough sketch. 3 stick figures standing outside a building with what appeared to be a very large spike on top. "That's the CN Tower," Freya clarified, pointing to the structure. "I'm going to see it on Saturday." She pointed to the smallest figure. "That's me." She pointed to the middle one. "That's Uncle Wesley." She hesitated before pointing to the third. "I wasn't sure who to put there, but I left space anyway." Claudia took the paper carefully. She didn't say anything for a moment, which was the only honest response. "That's very thoughtful," she said finally, and she meant it completely. Freya nodded, accepting this as her due, then announced that Marjorie had been looking into whether hot chocolate was available somewhere in the hotel, and she intended to follow up on this lead. She went back inside. The two adults on the terrace stood in the cold for another moment. "She's extraordinary," Claudia said. "I know," Wesley said, and the simplicity of how he said it, not with pride, not with performance, just the steady certainty of someone who'd had that particular fact to hold on to on the hard nights, said everything it needed to say. Claudia looked out at the city. "I'm sorry, Wesley, not because of how tonight turned out, not because you became." She gestured vaguely toward everything the evening had revealed about him. "I'm sorry because I stopped seeing you clearly long before I left, and I told myself a story about you that made it feel okay, and you never corrected me." "You weren't wrong to want more," he said. "You just went looking for it in the wrong place." She absorbed this quietly. You can keep the jacket until you go inside, he said, and left her there with it. 3 months later, in early March, Claudia called him on a Sunday morning. He was making pancakes. Freya was at the table, drawing Canada geese in formation on a napkin with a felt tip marker, narrating the aerodynamics to herself under her breath. He took the call in the hallway. Claudia was back at her firm. The engagement was over quietly, without much press beyond what had already been printed. She said she was doing all right. She sounded like someone who mostly meant it. They talked for 20 minutes about nothing in particular. Old friends, a restaurant in Kensington they'd both liked, the specific zizzery of Toronto winters. When the conversation started to wind down, she said, "I want you to know that I understand now. Why you did what you did." "Okay," he said. "I don't know if I'd have been brave enough," she said, "to walk away from someone to keep them safe." "You would have," he said. "You're braver than you think. You've just been measuring it wrong." A pause. "Do you think we could?" "Claudia," he said her name gently but clearly. She stopped. "I don't hate you," he said. "I'm not angry. I genuinely hope you find something real." He leaned against the hallway wall and could hear Freya through the kitchen door, explaining to the geese in her drawing why they needed to maintain their formation. "But I think we were each other's lesson, not each other's ending." She was quiet for a moment, then, "Yeah, okay," and it sounded like something setting down finally after a long time being carried. After he hung up, he stood in the hallway for a second. Then he went back into the kitchen and flipped the pancakes before they burned. "Was that Claudia?" Freya asked, without looking up from her geese. It was. "Is she going to be okay?" "Yeah," Wesley said, "she is." Freya finished the last goose in the V, held up the napkin, and appeared satisfied with what she'd made. "Good," she said. "People should be okay." Wesley set a plate of pancakes in front of her. Outside the kitchen window, the March light came in thin and pale and almost warm, the kind that promised something without quite delivering it yet, the kind that asked you to be patient just a little while longer. Freya picked up her fork. "Uncle Wesley?" "Yeah." "We're still going to the tower on Saturday." "We are," he said. She nodded, solemn with satisfaction, and ate her pancakes while the morning came in slowly around them.